The first reading is an excerpt from The Heart of Understanding by Thich Nhat Hanh, titled Roses and Garbage. Defiled or immaculate, dirty or pure. These are concepts we form in our mind. A beautiful rose we have just cut and placed in our vase is immaculate. It smells so good, so pure, so fresh. It supports the idea of immaculateness. The opposite is a garbage can. It smells horrible and is filled with rotten things, but that is only when you look on the surface. If you look more deeply, you will see that in just 5 or 6 days, the rose will become part of the garbage. You do not need to wait 5 days to see it. If you just look at the rose and you look deeply, you can see it now. And if you look into the garbage can, you can see that in a few months, its contents can be transformed into lovely vegetables and even a rose. If you're a good organic gardener, you have the eyes of a bodhisattva. Looking at a rose, you can see the garbage, and looking at the garbage, you can see the rose. Roses and garbage inter-are. Without a rose, we cannot have garbage, and without garbage, we cannot have a rose. They need each other very much. The rose and the garbage are equal. The garbage is just as precious as the rose. If we look deeply at the concept of defilement and immaculateness, we return to the notion of interbeing. Okay. The second reading is titled Caged Bird by Maya Angelou. A free bird leaps on the back of the wind and floats downstream till the current ends, and dips his wing in the orange sun rays and dares to claim the sky. But a bird that stalks down his narrow cage can seldom see through his bars of rage. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. The caged bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still, and his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the caged bird sings of freedom. The free bird thinks of another breeze, and the trade winds soft through the sighing trees, and the fat worms waiting on a dawn-bright lawn, and he names the sky his own. But a caged bird stands on the grave of dreams. His shadow shouts a nightmare scream. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. The caged bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still, and his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the caged bird sings of freedom. Today we continue with our summer series of other people's sermons. Today's talk is titled Caging Violence by the Reverend LMAcquafondata and will be read by Maria Rowe.
Welcome. Today I'll be reading a sermon by Dr. LMAcquafondata titled Caging Violence. Her sermon was awarded the Skinner Sermon Award in 2010. Lynn has 20 plus years of professional experience as a mental health counselor, a hospice chaplain, and a congregational minister. Lynn has I chose this sermon because I was struck at how her words resonate as a social justice treatise and cautionary story even more today. In 2014, California voters overwhelmingly passed Proposition 47, also known as the Safe Neighborhoods and Schools Act. At that time, California joined several other states that had addressed harsh penalties for low-level felonies like drug possession and simple theft by reclassifying them from felonies to misdemeanors, with the aim to reduce prison overcrowding and to support community safety. On our November 2024 ballot, there is a measure to repeal that act, despite research that shows incarceration can increase the likelihood of future crimes by traumatizing people before releasing them back into their communities. If the goal is public safety, punishing people for nonviolent crimes behind bars is not the answer. Lynn offers a vision of countering the cycles of violence that permeate our lives and communities. It aligns with the position of the Vera Institute of Justice. A humane approach rooted in dignity will make jails, prisons, and our communities safer. And now, her sermon. Thich Nhat Hanh's reading, Roses and Garbage, speaks of the cycles of nature, composting and transforming refuse into new growth, bringing beauty and hope. Thich Nhat Hanh goes on to apply this image to an ugly real-life situation. He speaks of a young teenager who becomes a prostitute in Manila to help her family earn money. She feels defiled and impure. She envies other girls who dress in finery, live in good families, and do not suffer as she does. Thich Nhat Hanh says, quote, "She's like this because other people are like that. No one among us has clean hands. No one of us can claim it's not our responsibility. The girl in Manila is that way because of the way we are," end quote. I don't often take the time to stop and think about girls forced into prostitution. When I do, it's easy to have compassion for a child and to begin to understand the cycles of wealth and poverty that lead to this kind of oppression. Thich Nhat Hanh's teaching applies to even more difficult situations. I rarely take the time to reflect on criminals who spend years, sometimes lifetimes in prison. I usually don't meet them on the street. I don't have any reason to visit them in their cells. I feel safe when they live far apart from me, forgotten, in cages, paying for the violence they've perpetrated on others. Clearly, if anyone is the garbage of society, it would be prisoners who have committed violent crimes and sometimes continue to victimize fellow prisoners. We, of course, would be the roses. Thich Nhat Hanh says that there cannot be one without the other. He would say we're all responsible at some level for what happens in prisons. Can that be true? The concept's not easy for most Americans to grapple with because our society is set up largely around black and white, this or that thinking. In his book, Violence, Reflections on National Epidemic, James Gilligan writes about how the courtroom aims to distinguish the good guys from the bad guys from the mad guys, and in more formal terms, it seeks to determine who's innocent, who's guilty, and who's criminally insane. But Gilligan says these distinctions are rarely clear-cut and end up limiting our ability to understand and prevent violence. He says, quote, "All human action, even that of a single individual, is relational," end quote. Though our country was founded on values which were influenced by some prominent Unitarians and Universalists, our prison and court systems have a long way to go before they truly respect the worth and dignity of every individual. Our systems have not reached a balanced reflection of justice, equity, and compassion that we espouse, though some individuals have advocated for change throughout the centuries. Dorothea Dix, Unitarian, began prison reform 150 years ago. When she visited prisons, she saw valuable human beings forced to live in disgusting and torturous conditions. She spoke out to the Massachusetts legislature, quote, "I come as an advocate of helpless, forgotten, insane men and women, of beings sunk into a condition from which the unconcerned world would start with real horror," end quote. In the end, her work improved conditions of prisons and mental hospitals in our country. However, many dark hidden corners of atrocity remain. The most important contribution of our Unitarian Universalist condition can make is to use our skills at observing the world in a wide range of shades of gray and apply it to this country's treatment of prisoners. In prison, cells are distinct, clearly separated units. With very little opportunity for daily life choices. The law requires that specific crimes be punished with set sentences, regardless of the details of each person and each situation. But the prisoner's world is filled with subtleties and ambiguities. Looking more closely through Gilligan's eyes, we can observe some of that complexity. Gilligan is a psychiatrist who spent 14 years serving as medical director of a prison mental hospital and then clinical director for the Massachusetts State Prison System. He did not anticipate what he would see and learn about prisoners in his work there. To start with, he found that the men he worked with experienced a blurring of the boundary between life and death. He wrote, "For the violent, the usual dichotomies between life and death, this world and the other world, rationality and irrationality, pleasure and pain, reward and punishment, the body and the soul, self-preservation and self-destruction have totally broken down," end quote. These men had experienced death of self, which occurs while the body is still living. So we speak of them as the living dead, biologically alive, yet spiritually and emotionally dead. Most importantly and most surprisingly to me, he found that this did not happen because they committed a murder. These men committed a murder or multiple murders because they already lived in this state. They felt incredible anguish at seeing others alive, but not being able to attain life themselves. He said, quote, "Some have told me they feel like robots or zombies, that they feel their bodies are empty or filled with straw, not flesh and blood, and that instead of having veins and nerves, they have ropes or cords," end quote. What causes human beings to become the living dead? The prisoners Gilligan worked with had experienced violence inflicted on them or those close to them since early childhood. Many had seen at least one parent or other close relative murdered as they watched. Many experienced physical and sexual abuse by their parents, relatives, or close friends. Some experienced extreme neglect and debilitating violent punishment from caregivers. For example, as a child, Donald C. was passed around nude at his parents' parties and used as a sexual party favor. Gilligan wrote, quote, "Without feelings of love, the self feels numb, empty, and dead." As I hear this, I see the image portrayed in Maya Angelou's poem, quote, "The caged bird stands on the grave of dreams," end quote. And in many cases, future criminals buried their dreams long before they committed a crime. The bars that caged in those people become primarily from perpetual neglect, abuse, shame, and despair, not iron. Gilligan observed that the living dead murder as a fruitless attempt to come alive again. Often violent criminals engage in vicious self-mutilation as well, violently cutting themselves or swallowing multiple razor blades. They use this as an attempt to feel something, anything. Unfortunately, the cycles of abuse do not always stop at the prison door. Gilligan describes a man he worked with, Lloyd A., who first served time in prison for a minor nonviolent crime. He acted in rebellious and provocative ways towards the prison guards, and they responded with harsh, dehumanizing punishment. He spent most of the last 2 years of his first sentence in solitary confinement, with no lights and no proper sewage. Then, instead of releasing him gradually into the community, having him live in a residential facility for a period of time, and helping him develop job skills, they simply let him go at the end of his sentence with no warming or preparation. A few days later, Lloyd A. hitchhiked. He killed one of the students who picked him up and nearly killed the other. When the caged bird opens his or her throat to sing, he sings with a fearful trill, which sometimes involves acting out a lifetime of rage and humiliation by slitting another person's throat. Gilligan wrote, quote, "Punishing someone in the way that he was punished does not protect the public. It only sends a human time bomb into the community where he's primed to explode the moment he resumes his first contact with another human being." Hopefully, that's an extreme and isolated situation, but it might not be. Last week, the government released a study finding that 12% of youth in juvenile detention facilities around the country report sexual victimization. 13 centers have particularly high rates, with nearly 1 out of every 3 inmates reporting some type of sexual abuse or victimization. Most of the victimization involves staff abusing youth rather than the youth victimizing each other. Would a youth who commits another more violent crime after being abused in detention be fully responsible? Was Lloyd A. solely responsible for his own violent actions? Or are these individuals not at all responsible because of the way they suffered at the hands of others? If I had the task of sitting on these juries, I would find it an impossible role. Who am I to either condemn or acquit under these circumstances? Often, murderers are both the filthiest garbage and the roses who someone has stomped on repeatedly. Kathy Larson wasn't part of the problem either. On May 14, 1998, her husband, Bill, went to work as usual as Director of Human Resources at Grace General Hospital in Winnipeg. He tried to work out a disagreement over the dismissal of a hospital maintenance employee. Dissatisfied with the process, the former employee returned that afternoon and stabbed him to death with a hunting knife. On a website about restorative justice, Kathy describes the intensity of her grieving process. She wrote about going through, quote, "a journey where one can become entrenched in the emotions of bitterness, rage, blame, and self-pity," end quote. The perpetrator seeded negative emotions into her family life through his actions. All of a sudden, this beautiful person took on emotions from the dark side of life. The rose wilted and began to decompose. Kathy Larson wrote about the struggle to make something positive come out of all of this. She said, quote, "These emotions seem natural, given the circumstances surrounding Bill's death." Kathy Larson wrote, quote, "Fortunately, these emotions did not prevail and block the healing process. At some point along the journey, I recognized that if I did fall victim to the clutches of anger and revenge, so would my sons. I was not prepared to sacrifice their futures," end quote. In addition, she found that the justice system, quote, "does not bring inner peace and healing. In reality, it can be a deterrent if one becomes hooked into it. The process of healing can progress naturally when one avoids the emotional entrapment of revenge," end quote. At some point, she took responsibility for her own wellness and healing and found ways to bring joy and happiness back into her life and her sons' lives. again. I don't know anything about the killer of Bill Larson, but in another tragic case, both of the accused murderers of the Pettit family had recently come out of prison after serving time for burglary. They were on parole. I don't know specifically what happened to them in prison, but we do know that beatings, gang rape, and other abuses are common in prison. We know that one of the accused men actually suffered rape in his earlier years. Gilligan quoted a man as saying that murder is not one event, but one point in a process. It sounds like there were many potential pertinent points in this process for these two men. The report on the Commission of Safety and Abuse in American Prisons, published in 2006, begins with a quote by Senator Richard J. Durbin about why what happens in prisons matters to us. He says, quote, "Most of us in Congress and most Americans do not spend a lot of time thinking about the conditions in prison across our nation, but we should. We should because what happens inside jails and prisons does not stay inside jails and prisons." Maya Angelou poetically linked prison and the free world by juxtaposing the image of two birds in a way which makes the visions and emotions overlap. Whether it points to physical bars or bars of oppression and victimization, it doesn't matter. What matters is that prison exists side by side with the free and unencumbered world, and one can easily merge into the other. Where do I come in? Where are the links of responsibility between the free world and the prison system? Breaking cycles of violence can only happen when we understand how those cycles develop and continue. We can only break the cycles when we understand societal responsibility. And societal responsibility means me and you, our roles. Thich Nhat Hanh emphasizes the role of the disparity of economics in his example. Economics plays a role in our treatment of prisoners as well, but in a different way. Violent criminals have often suffered extreme childhood abuse, and yet the people in our society who are trained to investigate child abuse and work to change and rehabilitate abusive families are often paid poverty wages. The turnover rate in these fields is high. The Commission on Safety and Abuse in American Prisons reported that correctional systems offer wages to their officers which compete with Walmart. The state of Louisiana paid the lowest starting salary in 2006 at $15,324. But no state paid a higher salary for correctional officers than New Jersey at $36,850. Those low wages combined with intense crowded facilities without enough backup lead to high turnover and poorly trained employees. Why is this true? Because people like you and I, average Americans, do not want our personal taxes increased to pay for services that benefit criminals. We want to cut costs and reduce waste. The system will not change unless people who have never committed a crime, nor ever been a victim of a crime, nor ever worked in or visited a prison, are willing to give up something to improve life for others, for the correctional officers and other prison workers, for the caseworkers and those who work with the abuser, as well as for the prisoners themselves. Why is this true? Because many of us are quick to distance ourselves and condemn abusers rather than take the time to see them as whole people like ourselves. What if our society treated abusive parents with love and respect, reaching out with compassionate options to help them break the chains of generations of violence and oppression, so that their children may learn to choose a healthy life? What if prison systems were designed to keep society safe, not just by locking people up, but by treating inmates for mental illness and addiction and providing education? What if we treated prisoners with love and respect, regardless of whether they deserve it or not? It's not about being altruistic. Many of these prisoners will get out and live as our neighbors or our family's neighbors one day. They can only act from what they have learned and experienced in life thus far. In addition, the way we treat others affects the quality of our own personal lives. When we reach out with love, compassion, and optimism, we can grow hope for ourselves. Shining a light on the dingy, frightening corners of human life helps to expose problems and lead to change. What makes it especially difficult is that this work also exposes the fragile, dark, and hidden corners of our own souls. We cannot have one without the other. But it works the other way too. We have opportunities every day to notice when people we come in contact with are in distress and take the time to listen. We can develop friendly interactions with adults and children. People are much more likely to ask for our help if they already know we care about them. We can work in more proactive ways. After I spoke at the Unitarian Universalist Church last weekend, congregants began talking about writing letters to a young man in prison who was the son of one of their members. Some considered the idea of advocating for change because the system had locked this young man up for 60 years for a crime that did not physically harm another human being. It's important to work for reforms in the system to help the people we already know and their families. It's equally important to work to help the sons and daughters of people we have never met, because all human life is intertwined. The problems in the system are overwhelming, but when we reach out with love and compassion and mutual respect, we can heal broken places in our own hearts, and we can work towards making the world a safer and more compassionate place for all people. Our closing words. In the words of Helen Keller, quote, "I am only one, but still I am one. I cannot do everything, but still I can do something. And just because I cannot do everything, I will not refuse to do something that I can do." End quote. So be it.